They said the room was for people who made the world move. It glittered with chandeliers and glass, the air warm with the quiet pride of people who never had to ask for anything twice. Laughter rose like champagne bubbles. At the far end, a grand piano waited, lacquered black and polished to a mirror. No one touched it. It sat like a promise that no one believed they had to keep. The first hook came as a line thrown like a coin to a beggar. "If you can play it, I will marry you." She said it with the softness of someone who has never feared a consequence. The young heiress smiled at her circle, knowing the sentence would ricochet around them, gathering delight. Heads turned. Glasses paused midway to lips. The dare was not about music. It was about power, and they all knew it. Near a distant column, a man in a navy uniform paused with a cloth in his hand. Samuel. He had trained himself to move without echo, to sweep away the fingerprints of people who never noticed his own. His hair was threaded with gray, his fingers cracked from soap and winter. He had wiped that very piano moments earlier and traced the cool edge of its keys with the same awe he once felt in front of a stage. Then he stepped back into the camouflage of ordinary chores. He was very good at vanishing. "Go on," the heiress said, tipping her chin toward the instrument. "Entertain us." Her friends leaned in, the way people lean in when they know a show is about to begin and they will not be its target. Someone chuckled, and that sound was the first cut. It made a question live in the room. Would he accept humiliation to end humiliation? Samuel placed the cloth in the pocket of his apron. He did not look at the girl who had spoken. He looked at the piano. He had not played in years. Once, he could melt an afternoon with a set of scales, weave sorrow and joy into a single thread that felt like breathing. Then a season of grief arrived without knocking, bills, medication, a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and endings. Music did not pay for anything that season. The world demanded a mop, not a sonata. "Do you hear me?" the heiress added, not unkind and not kind, the voice of someone testing a blade for sharpness. "If you can truly play it, I will marry you." Her circle erupted, not in shock but in sport. Engagement offered like a trick ring from a toy machine. No one asked whether the joke was tired. They were certain it was fresh because it was theirs. Samuel walked toward the piano and felt the room divide. On one side, the wealthy and their polished expectations. On the other, a man with a uniform and a past he wore like an undershirt, threadbare, hidden, essential. He did not touch the bench. He stood and let his fingertips rest just above the keys, feeling the chill radiating upward. It was not an exam, they would say. They would say it was only a laugh. But laughter, he knew, could bruise. "Do not worry," one guest called across the distance. "If you fail, you can still clean the floor after." The circle applauded the wit as if it were original. There was a time when Samuel would have looked for a manager, apologized for the disturbance that was not his fault, and returned to the safe, silent orbit of usefulness. But the keys were inches away. He stared at them and remembered the grammar of his youth, the way an arpeggio could forgive you for being human. He sat. The bench creaked softly, and somehow the tiny sound made the room lean closer. He placed his fingers on the keys. Cold like marble. His knuckles ached with the memory of scouring brushes. He tried a single note, middle C, the spine of the map. It rang too thin, a thread in a storm. Someone laughed and the thread snapped. Another hook slipped across the floor. What happens to a man when the thing he loves is summoned as a trick? Samuel inhaled and found the breath caught against his ribs like a door sticking in winter. He pressed a second note, then a third. The notes did not know each other yet. They were strangers at a table, polite and stiff. "Come now," the heiress said, stepping closer, her smile practiced and precise. "Surely your talent lies elsewhere." She tapped one key with her forefinger, a childish punctuation, and turned to her friends as if to say, "See, he is a piano the way a chandelier is a hammer." There are rooms where mercy is a foreign language. This felt like one. Yet one man in the back did not laugh. He was older than the others, his suit simple, the line of his mouth steady, his gaze anchored on Samuel's hands. The old man's eyes narrowed, not with suspicion but with recognition, as if a melody he had forgotten was tuning itself at the edge of hearing. Samuel tried again. A scale this time, gentle, then another, faster, asking his fingers to remember the highway exits of long practice. But memory is a river. If you have not visited the banks for years, the path back is overgrown. His ring finger slipped against a black key, producing a sour chime that sent a bright titter through the room. A second question unfurled: how many failures can a man endure in public before he breaks? He thought of the hospital room again, of holding a hand that grew quiet, of the day he traded concerts for night shifts because grief had emptied the cupboards. He had learned to make the floor shine because something had to shine. Perhaps the mop is more your instrument, a young man offered, clinking his glass against the heiresses in celebration of his line. Samuel stared at the keys and did not move. The silence stretched, thin as ice. He could stand. He could walk away and let the joke finish itself without his collaboration. But if he did that, the music inside him would hear the door shut again. He could not bear that second shutting. He lifted his hands once more. He would not try to be brilliant. He would try to be true. 2 notes, then 3, then 4, a hesitant pattern crawling toward coherence. The laughers kept laughing. The old man kept watching. The heiress tilted her head, and for the first time there was a flicker, not kindness, not yet, of curiosity. Samuel built a scaffold of notes, narrow, wobbly, but upright. He kept his eyes on the keys because looking up would mean seeing faces arranged into theater masks. Comedy, boredom, disdain. He did not need those expressions to tell him what he already knew, that this was a trial he had not asked for and could not avoid without losing a part of himself he still hoped to keep. The first passage held together like a sentence spoken by someone learning a language. The second passage trembled. He attempted a light trill and his right hand answered with the stiffness of a joint long and used. The trill collapsed into a stumble. He felt heat rising along his neck, a child's shame in a grown man's body. "Stop if you like," someone advised, the mercy of a referee eager to end a lopsided match. "We will not judge." But they had already judged, and mercy offered from a height is only another way to measure the distance. He thought of how his life had become a sequence of careful economies. A rented room. A kettle. Bread. The luxury of fruit when hours allowed a second job. Evenings shaped by the hum of washing machines and the discipline of mops. There is a certain holiness in such routines, a dignity he had discovered in doing a job so well that no one could complain. But there was no him in tonight's labor. Only a spotlight that had found him and would not move away. He tried a simple progression in a minor, the key that had once felt like confession and candlelight. The first chord resonated with a hint of warmth. He eased into the second and a young man leaned over the fallboard, pressing 2 random keys to make a brassy honk. Laughter burst like confetti. The interruption knocked Samuel's rhythm off its rails. He pulled his hands into his lap. In the back, the older man took half a step forward. A hand on his shoulder stopped him, a companion urging him to let the scene run its course. The older man paused, then kept watching, as if staying present were the only intervention he trusted. "Do you need a metronome?" the heiress asked with sugar in her tone and steel underneath. "Or are we the metronome?" She tapped the polished lid with a fingernail, ticking a mock beat. Another friend supplied a whistled rhythm. Someone else tried to harmonize and failed gloriously, collecting more laughter for his trouble. Samuel almost smiled at that. Failure, it turned out, was generous with everyone. A new hook tightened. You can humiliate a person into silence, but can you humiliate the music out of him? Samuel lowered his hands to the keys again. He exhaled and spoke to his fingers in a language only they could hear. "Do not aim for applause. Aim for honesty." He began an exercise he had learned at 16. Slow, even, patient, the piano equivalent of kneading dough. The notes linked without wobble this time, one after another, like steps on a modest path. The room's noise dulled by a fraction, then rose again as if embarrassed by its own silence. The heiress crossed her arms and came closer. Her face was flawlessly composed, the kind of symmetry you notice after advertisements teach you what to admire. Close up, her eyes were not cruel. They were bored. Boredom, Samuel understood, is cruelty's quiet cousin. It seeks entertainment, and when life refuses to perform, it prods. She leaned toward him, the sentence returning, trimmed and sharpened. "If you can truly play it, I will marry you." It was theater now, and she had found her line. Her friends laughed on cue because they liked her and liked staying invited. Samuel let the line pass as if it were a draft under the door. He pressed into the exercise, threading it into a melody that had lived in his chest for years without air. It was not a piece he had learned from any master. It was a small song formed out of evenings alone, a private door he sometimes opened in the dark to prove to himself that he still existed. The melody found him as muscles warmed, and for a precious 5 seconds the room dimmed to a far horizon. Then the past arrived like a photograph sliding under a door. A hospital bed. A monitor with patient, blinking lights. A voice, loved and weary, saying, "Play something just once." He had promised to come back the next day with a keyboard borrowed from a neighbor. The next day did not wait for him. By the time he reached the hospital, the bed was crisp and empty. Music, already a narrow bridge across worry, snapped under the weight of that news. He stopped playing for a year. Then 2. Then he stopped counting. A sour note dragged him back into the present. He cursed the memory for its timing and himself for letting it invade. The melody broke. He heard a chuckle too loud to be accidental. The old shame rose again, stubborn as a weed. The older man in the back finally spoke, his voice neither raised nor strained, and yet it carried. "Give us something we cannot forget," he said. Not a command. Not a plea. A kind of blessing, a benediction that sounded like permission. The room stilled, more out of surprise than respect. Who was he to speak without first asking the laughter for its consent? The heiress frowned at the interruption but did not silence it. There was a shard of interest in her gaze now, the flicker of someone realizing life might be larger than her script. Samuel closed his eyes. He had music stored in him the way trees store light, quiet, invisible, but ready. He had been ashamed to touch it because touching it meant touching everything else. But the old man's sentence made a door in the wall. He could step through or he could pretend not to see it and live with the regret. Regret had already taken too much. He set his hands on the keys and changed everything. Posture, breathing, intention. He did not ask his fingers to mimic the past. He asked them to tell the truth about this moment. Storm and stillness. Anger and restraint. Hope with a limp. He found his left hand's anchor first, laying down a progression that felt like a heart learning to trust its own rhythm again. The right hand answered with a question mark, a phrase that refused to resolve. Another hook. What happens when a man stops trying to be impressive and starts trying to be himself? The first measures grew from the floor up, sturdy and spare. He built a room inside the room, a space where his hands could speak without interruption. He did not play loud. He played clear. Clarity has a gravity of its own. It tugged at the attention in the air, rearranging the audience the way a strong tide rearranges a shoreline. The mocking whispers lowered as if embarrassed to be caught mid-sentence. The young man who had honked the random keys stepped back, blinking, his grin faltering into something uncertain. A woman near him tilted her head, brows lifting despite herself. The heiress uncrossed her arms and let them fall to her sides, fingers loosening as if she had been holding a heavy bag and finally set it down. Samuel's left hand found a pattern that moved like walking, step, 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 reliable as a street you have walked for years. His right hand braided a melody around it that suggested distances and returns, a climbing that did not boast and a descent that did not punish. The melody reached an edge and did not leap. It pivoted, looking down at what it had learned. The older man nodded once, a small, private salute. He recognized discipline under grace, the kind you cannot fake. He had hired musicians for events in his life and had learned to tell the difference between flash and craft. Craft can be quiet. It is often quiet. Its confidence comes from having survived many rooms just like this one. Samuel advanced into a phrase that would have frightened him 10 minutes earlier. His fingers remembered a run that flickered like rain along a railing. He let it go and felt the old thrill rise, the one that told him he was not a collection of duties but a person with a lineage of days when sound and meaning met in his chest and made him larger. The room did not breathe. Silence is not always absence. Sometimes it is attendance, fully paid. Someone at the back coughed and then promptly looked mortified, as if the cough had scratched the varnish from a sacred thing. A new question ticked. If the promise was born as a joke, what happens to it when the joke fails? The heiress watched his hands as if they held a language she almost understood. Her smile, so easy earlier, disappeared. What replaced it was not sorrow and not admiration. It was the unease of recalibration, the human process of admitting that your map was wrong and the city is different than you thought. Samuel shifted into a passage that asked for speed and lightness, the pianistic equivalent of running downhill without falling. His wrists softened, his fingers blurred, and then, just when momentum threatened to outrun control, he landed on a chord as balanced as a bird on a wire. A small sound escaped someone near the front, not a laugh this time but a sharp intake of breath, involuntary, honest. In the pause between passages, the older man spoke again, not to Samuel now but to the room itself. "There," he said, the word low and sure. The single syllable worked like a tuner's fork. It found resonance. Samuel took the resonance and fed it back into the music. He introduced a counter-melody in the left hand, gently tugging against the right, letting tension and harmony argue like two friends who love each other enough to disagree. He found space for quiet, too, thinning the texture until each note felt like a stone placed carefully across a stream. The melody could cross now without getting wet. The heiress's friends exchanged glances that did not know where to land. A joke wandered the edges of the group, looking for a mouth and found none. A few of them looked at the heiress for permission to keep laughing. She did not provide it. Then came the passage Samuel had feared most, the one that used to slice his confidence because it required precision without the armor of volume. He thought of the hospital again, but this time the memory did not sink a hook into him. It drifted by like a boat he could wave to without boarding. He played the passage and the notes lined up, clean as laundry on a bright day. It was not triumphal. It was exact. Exactness broke the spell of contempt in the room. People who had never in their lives scrubbed a floor recognized labor when it stood in front of them, crafted into beauty. Something cracked, and through the crack slipped respect. Samuel brought the piece into its heart. Not the fastest part, not the loudest, but the spot where melody and rhythm decide to trust each other. He let a single note ring longer than comfort, then caught it with a chord that felt inevitable. Inevitability is the secret of art that seems simple. It makes you wonder why no one else could have made the same choice and realized too late that it required 1,000 choices before it to be available at all. He ended, not with a flourish, but with a closing that fit the opening like the last stitch in a seam. The final chord hovered, traveling along the ceiling, down the crystal, into the bones of the people listening. He lifted his hands and placed them carefully in his lap. The older man began to clap. He did not look to his neighbors for permission. The clap echoed, bounced, returned. One person joined, then another, the way a crowd decides to be a crowd instead of a collection of strangers. The applause was not wild. It was earnest. An apology conducted by palms. The heiress did not move for a breath, then another. Her lips parted. Something flickered across her face, embarrassment surely, but also relief. Relief at the discovery that the world could still surprise her. She had not paid for this surprise. That was the point. Another hook, now pointed at everyone in the room. What is a promise worth if it was made to belittle, and what do you do with it when a man shows you the one thing you cannot buy? The applause softened and settled. That was when words became heavy again. The heiress turned toward her friends. Some avoided her eyes, suddenly fascinated by their glasses. Social courage is rarer than anyone admits. It takes practice. No one had practiced. She faced Samuel. "I was wrong," she said, and the room registered those 3 words as if they were an event with catering. She said them simply, without hedging. The sentence did not erase what had come before, but it placed a sign beside it. Here is the beginning of a different map. Samuel inclined his head, nothing theatrical. The old embarrassment still warmed his neck, but it no longer owned the deed to the night. He was tired, the good tired that follows work worth doing. The piano's keys had lost their marble chill under his hands and felt like companions again. The older man stepped forward through a parted sea of observers. He extended his hand to Samuel. "What you have," he said, "does not come from money, and it cannot be purchased by it." He turned, not accusing and not preaching, and spoke to the nearest faces. "Some values are denominated in hours and humility. If you have not paid in those, you cannot hold the currency." There was a murmur, not disagreement so much as discomfort adjusting its collar. The heiress's jaw tightened, then loosened. She looked at Samuel again. "I said something foolish," she offered, not fishing for a pardon. "I am sorry." The apology did not sparkle. It did something better. It landed. Another question surfaced, not about vows or wagers but about dignity. What does a person owe himself after being mocked and then admired? Samuel could have taken his bow and left. He could have used the apology like a coat against the night and gone home a little warmer. He considered how quickly attention would cool, like tea forgotten on a windowsill. He did not need their warmth to survive. He had learned how to make his own. "I do not want a marriage," Samuel said, matter-of-fact, not unkind. "I want people to be careful with each other." The sentence surprised even him, but once spoken it fit. He did not ask for respect. He enacted it, offering the room a model they had not expected to receive from a man in a uniform. The older man's eyes brightened. "Care is the more difficult promise," he said, almost to himself. A few guests approached Samuel to shake his hand, the way people shake hands with decency, hoping some will rub off. The young man who had pressed the random keys looked as if he might speak, then did not. He settled for a nod that approached apology without the courage to become one. Courage, too, requires practice. The heiress remained where she was, as if leaving would excuse her from finishing the lesson. "Would you teach me something?" she asked at last, the sentence fragile but intact. "I never learned to listen to music that way." It was an honest request. Honest requests make honest refusals possible. Samuel thought of the decades that had divided him from the boy who once wanted to compose his own work and hear it breathe in a room. He thought of the hospital and the second job and the precise way lemon cleaner stings the cuticles in winter. He thought of the old man's face, patient and alert, the look of a listener who had carried silence around like a useful tool. Here is something to learn first, Samuel said gently. Make fewer dares. Ask more questions. He was not scolding. He was giving her a key he had polished through long use. She nodded, a little awkward, which is to say genuinely. The older man leaned closer to Samuel. If you ever wish to play again in a room that wants to be quiet, call me, he said, handing over a card. It did not glitter. It did not need to. The invitation was not a rescue. It was a recognition. There is a difference. The evening did not turn into a fairy tale. It did not need to. The room shifted just a few degrees, the way a ship changes course with a small correction that becomes enormous over distance. People resumed their conversations, but their voices were different, lowered by a notch, as if the air asked for less abrasion. Samuel stood from the bench. He smoothed the apron that had been his armor and his livelihood. The piano sat quiet again, but not as a prop. It had become, for a few minutes, what it had always been, a tool for honesty. He touched the edge of the fallboard with 2 fingers, a farewell that doubled as a thank you. On his way back to the work that still awaited him, because work always waits, he passed the older man who said nothing more than good night, and made those 2 words sound like the opposite of dismissal. He passed the heiress, who held his gaze long enough to communicate that she had arrived at a new map and was trying to read it. He passed the man who had honked the keys, who studied the tips of his shoes and discovered, too late, that shame is a teacher that charges high fees. Samuel collected his tools. The cloth waited in the pocket where he had left it. He took it out and felt the grain of the fabric against his palm. He did not resent the cloth. It had kept the lights on when the music could not. It had taught him patience, precision, and the quiet pride of leaving a place better than he found it. He folded it carefully, the way a musician folds a program after a performance that mattered. A final hook for the heart remained, the kind that does not ask for applause. What truly marries a person in this life is not a ceremony and not a dare, but a vow they make in private and keep in public. Samuel walked into the corridor, and each step sounded ordinary. That was the mercy of it. The extraordinary did not need to rescue him. It needed only to remind him of what he already carried. Outside the night was cool. He breathed it in, the way a man tastes water after a long day. He did not feel triumphant. Triumphant is loud and temporary. He felt aligned. Alignment lasts. It turns mop strokes into measures and measures into meaning. It turns a room of people into a chance for decency. Later, when he lay in his narrow bed, the melody returned, not as a performance but as a companion. He followed it to its soft ending and slept without the ache of regret. In the morning, there would be floors to clean and perhaps, later, a small keyboard to visit in the corner of his room. There would be bills and buses and the faithful rhythm of work. And there would be something else too, a certainty that he could cross the private bridge to music whenever he chose, because the bridge was built from hours he had already paid. That is the unbuyable thing the older man had named without naming. You cannot purchase a soul that has practiced returning to itself. You can only witness it and decide what to do next with your own. Samuel closed his eyes and heard, very faintly, the echo of a room remembering how to listen. He did not need the room. But he was grateful that, for a few minutes, the room had needed him. And in that quiet gratitude, the world felt wider, the night kinder, and the promise of the day not a dare but an invitation.